Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to the CSMI radio broadcast, Today's Christian Music with James.
Good afternoon. With me on the phone is Mr., or I should say Pastor Bob Hay, who's writing a book called Instruments of War about the history of contemporary Christian music. Bob, how are you today?
Doing well, Brad. Doing well.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. So, where do we begin with the history of Christian music? Do we go all the way back to the 60s?
Well, I'd say, we do. You know, some of the first we would call contemporary music does go back into the 60s, 67, 68, back in there. But the heyday, of course, didn't come until probably the very early 70s. And, you know, some people would say that that period of time, that revival that we called the Jesus movement, wasn't a genuine revival, but it certainly was. And it swept millions of people into the kingdom of God. And, it was also a worldwide revival. It wasn't just in California, or it wasn't just in America. It was a revival that spread, really. Well,
one little bit of history, I know that people point back to Explo 72 was one of the focal points, but I think you and I'd agree that 1969, Larry Norman recorded Upon This Rock. Capitol Records didn't know what to do with it, shopped it around, and then he finally landed with the Benson Company that distributed it. But the point I was getting to was with right after Explo 72, a group from California, Love Song, actually had a number one hit in the Philippines off that record called Love Song. Do you remember that?
Well, I remember the song well, remember the group well. I think it was about 1973 when we did them in concert in Jacksonville, Florida. I'm not sure. I'd have to look through my old T-shirts.
Right.
But right about that time, 72, 73, we brought them to our town. Had a great concert with them. And later did some things with Chuck Girard, who was the lead singer of Love Song, who later went solo. But they were wonderful guys.
Yep. Well, back in the early days, you had Maranatha Music, and you had Good News Records, and then there was a slew of independent custom recordings of some Christian artists. But
right. Well, you also had Myrrh.
Love Song is on Good. Right. And I seem to recall there was a distributor by the name of Sunrise Mercantile Company that if you didn't have a Christian bookstore that sold the Christian music around the corner, you could order it through the mail from them.
Yeah.
And they seemed to have everybody. And I remember getting the Children of the Day album and Larry Norman from Sunrise Mercantile Company, and the Love Song album I bought back in the day, I actually bought in either a Sears record department or an E.J. Corvette's record department, which are long gone by now, but fond memories.
Well, it was an interesting time. I said in something I wrote, it was a string of thoughts, but at the end, the last thought was, and bands stayed in your home. we didn't have the star system back then. We were pointing everybody to the true star, Jesus. And so, bands would come through, and like I say, they'd sleep on your couch, or if we got a chance to be in a church, we'd eat cold pizza in the fellowship hall after a concert. It was a much simpler time. In fact, I remember right at the end of the 70s, and I can't think of the guy's name, but he wrote a column in CCM magazine, and he made the statement, "We used to be making history. Now we're making a living."
Right.
I long for the days when we used to be
Fisher.
making history. Beg your pardon?
Right. I said, I think that was John Fisher who wrote that column.
John Fisher, right. John Fisher. I should have got down the book I was writing years ago that I never finished, and refreshed my memory on all these things. I'm getting so old I can't remember half the things that were going on and the things that we did.
Well, that's okay. I'm chasing after you, as far as getting older, but I still have pretty good recall of a lot of what went down in those days because I got saved during the Jesus movement and was very influenced by Christian music and the artists of that time. And remember, I'll fill in some of the cracks for you.
Okay.
But your perspective is that what set up the Jesus movement and the revival actually was seeded in the civil rights movement and perhaps even some of the anti-war protests that went on. And I know that Chapter 2 of your book, refers to Dr. Martin Luther King rather heavily, as well as both of those other movements I just referenced. So,
yeah.
How did that figure in?
Well, in the 60s, we had so much, young people, college students, as I think I said in the book, dropped out of college, got a backpack and a flannel shirt and hit the road. And, they were so discouraged by the Vietnam War and the things that were going on that so, boy, am I fading out on this, trying to think back all of these things. But what I said in the book that I think I described it, the discouragement and the disenchantment with, everything that was going on. And so these college kids, dropped out of school, got a backpack, hit the road, got into drugs, got so, and everything they looked for and thought was going to happen wasn't happening. They thought they could end the war by demonstrations and marches and picketing, and the war only got bigger. The war that was in Vietnam had spread to Laos and Cambodia and throughout the region. And so that's when the kids just said, hey, we're not going to change this. And they just, in a nutshell, just said, let's just get stoned and forget about it.
Well, Dr. Timothy Leary's famous statement was, what was it? Turn on, drop out, and
turn on, drop out, and something else.
Right.
Wow, I haven't thought of this in so long.
I know.
Tune in, turn on. Tune in, turn on, drop out.
Right.
I think is the way it went.
You're correct. You're exactly right. So that's kind of what fueled a lot of us young people in the day was
right.
that kind of encouragement. And so there was a need, I think a genuine need. People were searching for truth, and that was kind of the open door that the Jesus movement had. And, you know, churches that back in the day did not like rock and roll music. So when you put Christian lyrics to rock and roll music, boy, that was like putting a match to TNT, as I remember. And a lot of churches just didn't want to have anything of it.
Yeah, really. Very few churches were open to it, you know. But the ones that were saw amazing growth in their youth, and the size of their youth, you know, not just spiritual growth, but there was just it was a genuine revival. You know, John Dawson called it the Jesus movement, the first contemporary revival. And it started in California, but it also, you know, it sprang up in Florida on the beaches down there. A place, you know, there were 2 or 3 places that were just must-go, must-see places, or if you're in a band, must-play places. One of those was the Adam's Apple Coffee House, a church in Fort Wayne, Indiana, Calvary Temple. Built a new church, and they turned their old church over to the youth ministry, and they started a coffee house called the Adam's Apple. A girl named Honeytree was the secretary of the Adam's Apple, and she went on to be, well, she's still out there singing and playing today. I saw her, well, I think you and I saw her last summer at a conference we were at.
No, I wasn't at that one, but you're right. She was at a CSMI conference last year.
I thought you were there. I don't know why.
No,
I thought you were there.
Work. Yeah, no, I missed that one, but I was at the one a year earlier, and I'll be in Nashville in a couple of weeks speaking at the Connect event. But anyway, back to the history of CCM. It was kind of interesting because there was nowhere for these bands to go. Secular radio shunned them. There wasn't anything like contemporary Christian music radio, but there were a couple of DJs that would persuade their bosses to let them have an hour on Sunday morning or a couple hours when there wasn't a huge audience, and they'd play the Christian music. Do you remember some of those shows, like Powerline, which I think was United Methodist Church?
Was that
and then there
Methodist
was a
church?
show out of Dallas.
Yeah, of course, Frank Edmondson, whose radio name was Paul Baker, I think he did a show. Of course, Jerry Bryant, if you're a name that some people may remember. Jerry Bryant had a show. Scott Ross
Full Circle Jesus music, Scott Ross.
Interesting situation with Scott and how he got saved. He was a DJ in New York City, and he was a DJ for the Beatles concert at Shea Stadium in 1964, a little before the movement started. But lost his job because of drugs and was sitting in a Central Park and crying out for help, and somehow got miraculously saved sitting on a bench there, and got a job in one of the stations owned by Pat Robertson. And some of the new contemporary music, and got called on the carpet, for doing that. But he thought, boy, we could reach people with this, and he started a syndicated radio show called The Scott Ross Show, and was on several hundred top rock stations around the country.
Yeah, well, they had
back
the name
then,
recognition.
back then, Christian secular radio stations had to give so much time to public service. So
Right.
if you were a rock and roll station manager, you didn't want to give time to Pastor Jones at First Methodist Church when you could use a hot rock show like the Scott Ross Show. So he was on about 200 stations across the country and winning a lot of souls through that music.
This is true. Well, let's. So we've kind of set the stage for how this movement happened. People were searching for truth. There was no Christian music industry, and I hate to use that term, but there wasn't any real organized. There was a very ad hoc kind of thing with pockets here and there where people who caught the vision could, program the music and bring in the artists and do that sort of thing. And, it was very much youth oriented. Now, when you were promoting concerts back in the day, why don't you take everyone through what a typical concert prep was, how you'd get in contact with the artist, and then what kind of arrangements you had with them when they'd show up and play, and the accommodations, and then, some of the interactions you've had with some of the pioneers, like Love Song or Keith Green or some of the other, whoever you want to talk about. Just let people know what it was really like, because they don't get it.
First of all, it was much simpler. We didn't have the 20-page contract and rider, and bands quite often would stay in your home, sleep on your couch. They didn't require 4-star hotels or motels. They traveled in beat-up old school buses or, step vans with bunks in them somehow. And like I say, they didn't require all the things that would later come into the contemporary Christian music scene. Again, they stayed in your homes, didn't require fancy meals. It might be cold pizza in the fellowship hall of the church after the concert. Love offerings quite often were sufficient, not thousands of dollars as it later came to be. And so they were very simple, and they might even come in and do free concerts, or we could get them in high schools at the time a lot, because it just that was just the way it was. You could get them into schools, and sometimes we'd do assembly programs during the week and then do a big concert, ticketed concert on Friday night or Saturday night. Kids were being saved at these concerts, and I think it was, probably in the mid-'70s, when, maybe a little later than that, but after a while, some of the concerts started or stopped doing altar calls, and that really frosted me. I went to a concert by a popular singer in the day, and I was actually there for setup, and when they mentioned they weren't going to do an altar call, I was shocked, because you always did an altar call in those concerts, and you always hopefully had people ready to counsel, because you would see hundreds of people getting saved at some of these events. We could at times get them into high schools, and so tell me what the question was again, because I'm just so.
We were talking about the different of what, how simple it was to put on a concert. The artists weren't as demanding. It seemed like there was a higher element of faith. They just take off on the road. And didn't you find that a lot of these groups were just believing God for their, daily provision, that they'd have a roof over their head, and their mandate was just to go out and share the gospel in music and let God take care of the rest of those details? Very true. It was a completely different mindset from what you see today, I think. And it's kind of, shocking to hear that as early as the mid-'70s that there was a backlash against altar calls, because I remember seeing Res Band and DeGarmo and Key, and, some people couldn't preach as good as, Dana Key in terms of reaching young people, or, the lead guitarist of Res Band, they're at Japuza USA in Chicago, Len Kaiser. These were on fire. I'm telling you, I felt like I was hearing like George Whitefield or some of these other, revivalists, but they were speaking my language as a young person. And it was electrifying. I mean, the music alone was radical enough, but then to hear this, talk about Jesus, and Larry
never
Norman
went
and
to
Randy
a concert.
Stonehill.
Yeah, what I just interrupted, and I apologize, but you never went to a concert where there wasn't an altar call.
Yeah.
It was all about winning souls.
Yeah. And, somewhere along the line we lost our way from that, wouldn't you say?
I would say. Yeah, it's sad. It was sad. There was such purity to it. The whole thing, the whole Jesus movement, the whole revival, it was so pure. Now, some people would say it wasn't a revival. Some people, there were not a lot of churches, or let me put it this way, there were a lot of churches that would have nothing to do with it. But the churches that were open to it, boy, they could see growth in their youth department like nowhere else.
Virtually overnight in some cases.
Yeah, it was amazing. I know in our little story was that my pastor, I was in a little beach church down in Florida, or a little church in a beach town, and my pastor got a phone call one day, and it was some people, he said, that claimed to play rock and roll for Jesus, and they wanted to meet him for coffee. So he called me up and said, "Hey, you want to go?" And I said, "Yeah, let's go check it out." And so we went to a restaurant, sat down with these guys, and they were kind of weird-looking guys, bell-bottom jeans and, long hair, and the gals in
paisley shirts and love beads,
granny dresses,
and sandals. Yeah.
Yeah,
sure.
yeah. And the leader of the group, beg your pardon?
I said I remember that uniform very well.
Right. And the leader of the group, a guy named Papa John Heron, said, no, what did Papa John Heron say? He said, "I drive an Oldsmobile, and I don't think there's anything sinful about an Oldsmobile. You can drive it to a tavern, or you can drive it to church. And that's the way we feel about our music. We don't think there's anything sinful about it," and that might not be quite the way he put it. But anyway, after sitting and talking with them guys and having coffee, my pastor said, "Well, what do you think?" And I said, "Well, I think I'm going to give them my Sunday night service." This was in a beach town down in Florida, and on Sunday night, I would have a youth service that would draw kids from all the rest of the churches in town. And so Sunday night came, they playing their music, unlike anything we'd ever heard. The windows were blowing out of the little church building, and at the end of the concert, they gave an altar call, and the altars were packed, And I thought, wow, this'll work. And from that simple concert, we started doing concerts just about every month, and we brought in everybody. Oh, the group that we brought in that night was the Res Band, and they were playing Christian music unlike anything we'd ever heard.
Sure.
So then a couple of months later, we brought in Andre Crouch. That was January of 1971 or 72. I'm not sure which. The following month, we brought in Andre Crouch. We brought in Second Chapter of Acts and Barry McGuire. And then for just about 5 years, we seemed to have a concert just about every month. And worked with just about everybody that was out there. And there was such a purity, Didn't need 4-star hotels. Hey, they'd come sleep in your house, sleep on your couch. Didn't have the big 12-page, 20-page rider in the contract. It was so simple and so pure, but so many kids had genuine conversions. There's a guy out in Hollywood, California by the name of Dwayne Peterson, and he published a street paper, these were popular back in the hippie days. And he published a street paper, and he got saved, and anyway, changed the paper to a Christian street paper. But the point I want to make is that a newspaper guy or a newsman was talking to him one time, and he said, these young people that are getting saved, they're freaks. They're Jesus freaks. And Dwayne said, no, they're not, man. They're people. They're Jesus people. And the name stuck. And so we called the kids, the young people that were getting saved, Jesus people or Jesus freaks. And it was an amazing time, and it was a genuine revival. History probably doesn't do it justice, and probably they don't teach it in Bible school when they talk about revival. They don't, they will mention other revivals, but probably neglect what was a genuine worldwide move of God among young people.
Well, I know that at Liberty University they do teach a course, and I think they offer a major in contemporary Christian music, and they do go into the history of the music. And we've just started to scratch the surface, Bob. So I'm hoping that you'll have time to join me again next week, so we can continue this conversation and education of our audience a little bit. And perhaps next week we can talk a little bit more about the differences in the songwriting and maybe the production values and some of those technical things, as well as getting into some of the groups, a little more detail about many of the groups that have come out of the Jesus movement and so on and so forth. So I hope to have you back next week. You got time to talk a little bit more with me about this on the next show?
Yes, I do. And I'll try to be better prepared than I was this week.
Okay. Well, that sounds great. Well, everybody tune in next week. Bob Hay will be back with us, and we'll continue the conversation about the history of contemporary Christian music.
This has been the radio broadcast, Today's Christian Music with James Burkhardt. For more information about Christian songwriters and musicians international, please go to our website at www.csminetwork.com or email us at cwnnashville@gmail.com. God bless.